Hi, I'm David Lahti. I'm an evolutionary biologist and a moral philosopher at the City University of New York. And I want to ask, can an evolutionary biologist believe in God?
Professor Lahti, thank you so much for being with us today. I really appreciate it.
Good to be here, David.
So you're a professor of evolutionary biology at King's College, City University of New York, and you're a moral philosopher as well. What was that journey like? How did you come to where you are today?
Well, I've always loved nature. So some people come to science from nature, and some people come to nature through science. And I was the first type of person. I was always a lover of nature as a kid, and eventually when I discovered that people could study it for a living, that I knew that that's what I wanted to do. A lot of people think it's rather odd that I am a philosopher and a scientist at the same time. There's this idea of two cultures. There's the humanities and the sciences, and never the twain shall meet. But in fact, biology used to be called natural philosophy. And so I just consider myself in that older tradition of my studies of nature being a sort of philosophical enterprise in addition to being a scientific one.
When you were an undergrad, did you have this vision of doing both philosophy and biology?
No, actually, I did find myself just as interested in the ideas that we have about nature as nature itself. But I never thought that I was going to be a philosopher. I joke that I got my philosophy PhD by accident because I went to England to study environmental ethics and perhaps get a master's in it, and then go directly into a PhD in biology. But then I loved it so much I ended up getting a PhD in philosophy first. But I always knew that I was going to come back and do biology.
What about philosophy convinced you to stick around and do the PhD?
At first, when I went to Oxford to do environmental ethics, I was confronted by evolutionary biologists who were saying, there is no such thing as an environmental ethic. Ethics derives, or morality derives from reciprocity and kin selection in human groups. And so there is no sense in asking what our duties are to the natural world. And that was very strange, and I thought that was an overreach by the evolutionary biologists. So my philosophical interest then changed over there and became an investigation of what evolution can and cannot say about humans and about morality in particular.
You grew up as a Christian or identifying as a Christian, is that correct?
Yeah, that's right, and in a Christian home.
Yeah, and so were there points where the idea of going into the natural sciences and then going into evolutionary biology, were there points where that was a particular tension for you personally?
When I was young, I had to deal with the conflict between the way my family and church saw creation and the way that biologists see nature. And of course, these looked at sometimes to be in such warfare that there would be no bringing them together. But having gone to a Christian college, Gordon College, where all of the biologists accepted both the existence of God and the process of evolution underlying all organisms, including humans, and then going to Au Sable Institute of Environmental Studies, where there were even more people who held those views, I quickly in college dealt with that conflict and essentially removed it from my consciousness, although it's still very much of a part of my outreach.
So your research focuses on how organisms look and how they act. Can you tell us a little bit more about your field research and how you do what you do?
Right. So I am interested in organisms and their traits and how they're fashioned by evolution and through evolution by natural selection. I'm especially interested in traits that are complex, often those that involve learning in birds and mammals, including humans, such as traits involved in communication and cooperation. And cooperation in its highest and most complex form, of course, is human morality.
Prior to sitting down with you, I took a look at some of the type of research your lab does, and it's a wide variety of really interesting stuff, right? But it's the physics, function, and evolution of blue egg color in birds, relaxed selection, trait loss, and evolution, the ecology of vocal mimicry in the northern mockingbird, the interactions between inheritance and learning, and the development of the canary. Right? I mean, there's a canary song.
Yeah, yeah. So we've got a quite a large lab. So there are 25 people in there, ranging from undergraduates through master's students, PhD students, and postdoctoral researchers. So I'm not personally involved in all of the projects that are going on, but I oversee all the projects that are going on. And the one thing that knits them all together is an appreciation of the interaction between inheritance and learning and other environmental features. So nature and nurture working together through development.
Yeah. Is there an example from any of these that would come to mind that just to help us imagine what a day-to-day is in the life of your team who's studying vocal mimicry in the northern mockingbird, for instance? How
Sure.
do you do that?
So the Mockingbird Project right now, there's a couple of students who have been working on that, recording both in New York and in Texas. And so the question there is, we know that mockingbirds mimic other sounds that they hear, whether it's birds, such as other mockingbirds, or other species of birds, or car horns and car alarms and cell phones, et cetera. But what we don't know is how closely the repertoire of a given bird is tied to where they happen to live. Could we listen to a Texan a mockingbird, and know that it was from Texas, or where it grew up based on what it sings? I suspect that we would be able to do that, but no one's actually looked into that, so we're testing that.
You've also done a lot of work, as we mentioned before, on the intersection between moral philosophy and evolutionary biology.
That's right.
One of the papers you wrote talks about sort of the idea of you have a thesis from or moral philosopher, antithesis from evolutionary biologists, and then you suggest some ideas on synthesis.
Right.
Can you walk us through a little bit, maybe that argument and sort of that
Sure.
outline?
Sure, yeah, that paper is on the partnership between natural philosophy and moral philosophy, or between biology and moral philosophy, you could say. And that came out of a volume where half of the chapters were moral philosophers, and they tended to be rather denigrating towards evolutionary biologists studying morality. The other half of the book was composed of chapters written by evolutionary biologists, and they tend to be a little bit dismissive of the philosophers. And it's ironic that these two groups of people studying the exact same thing, human morality, this phenomenon, this cognitive, social, biological, and philosophical phenomenon, have so little to say to each other, or so little, they think, to learn from each other. And so what I was trying to do in that piece was to sketch a way forward where we could have a more holistic understanding of ourselves, where both the natural philosophers and the moral philosophers, in other words, the biologists and the ethicists, can have a fruitful interchange of ideas. So this comes from this warfare idea that we just talked about in terms of science and religion. Well, it's there between philosophy and science too.
I love the way you start that paper. You say academia is currently in an awkward transitional period where pairs of fields with identical subject matter share little else but mutual disdain. That was a great way to set that up. So how should they be supporting one another? What are the linkages where they can mutually reinforce their pursuits?
Well, maybe it would be helpful for me to answer that by providing an example. So with respect to morality in particular, what morality is to any human being is the question of what is good, and what is the best life, how then should we live. And from a biological perspective, we don't look directly at the answer to that question. That's a philosophical or theological question. We look at the answers that people tend to have given to that question, which is different, because we're not assessing the truth of it. We're just looking for psychological, sociological fact. And then also, how did we become the kinds of organisms that ask those questions in the first place, and try to answer them and live by them? Why are we those kinds of organisms? How did we get there? And so when we ask questions about morality, the question of what is good and the question of what people have tended to think is good are inextricably bound up together. We are doing a little bit of biology and a little bit of ethics every time we decide what we are supposed to do and whether someone else agrees with us or not, et cetera. And so I think that in order to have a holistic understanding of morality or anything about humans, we really need to have a philosophical perspective on it, which includes a theological perspective, and then, of course, the empirical, biological and psychological perspective.
Is there an example where understanding human beings as not de novo, beings who came into existence at a particular moment of time, but sort of this evolutionary progression, is there an example where that actually helps shape and inform your moral philosophy?
Yes, I think that one of the biggest mistakes that moral philosophers have made is to assume that all of morality popped into existence as a single monolithic entity. Whereas from a biological perspective, that's not a tenable hypothesis. Certain goods, certain things that we universally endorse morally, for instance, is taking care of our kids. And that behavior and the bond between, that was originally between a mother and her offspring and now is between any humans, is something that's 140 million years old. It's as old as lactation. And so essentially the roots of love are in nursing offspring. And so we have to realize that among the very first moral realizations must have been something like that too. Whereas, as Charles Darwin says, and we all understand, the idea that all humans are equally morally considerable, regardless of sex, race, anything else about a person that they do not choose for themselves, is something that we have only come to realize as a society very recently. It doesn't mean that there were some people a long time ago who realized that. There probably were. But that is something that we have to teach. We didn't inherit that in the way that we inherited a love for our children. And so these two moral principles, love your children, take care of them, and all humans are equally morally considerable, have very different histories. And so we have to respect that as philosophers, and that's something that only the biologists could have told us.
How do you, can a theologian and a biologist or evolutionary biologist work together to help shape and understand something like morality? Can or should?
Yes, I believe that they should, and I believe that they can. I think the biologist provides just factual information or claims the factual information about the history, the functions, if any, of either particular moral positions or morality as a whole. And so that's the science of morality. But that's not really where the good stuff is. The good stuff is actually doing it, answering the question that morality poses, which is how then should we live, and what is good and bad, et cetera. And that's where the theologian or the philosopher comes in, trying to enrich the content of that question and then find out what the answer to it is. And so, to paraphrase and appropriate a statement of Einstein's, if we were to do only the science of morality and we just neglected the question of that morality poses to us or of how we should live, that would be kind of useless. You'd be studying something that you then do not actually put into practice. It's like, why are you interested in studying it in the first place? Whereas, on the other hand, if you were to engage in the business of morality by actually trying to live a life that you believe is good and you have some content to where that goodness came from, but you don't care about the facts of the matter in terms of the history of morality or the advantages it might have given our ancestors or where it comes from, that's fine. It's fine, but it does leave us in ignorance in a certain way. And I think it's natural for us to try to get out of ignorance. We want to remove our ignorance wherever we can. So I think that's where both biology and theology or philosophy both have something to say here.
So I think you in some unique ways sit at the cusp of this partnership or potential partnership. What are the, as you look for the next 5, 10, 15 years, what are the questions that you think are going to be most relevant, lend the most value to that partnership between theology and biology?
I believe that the integration of the science of morality and the philosophy or theology of it is just beginning to be integrated. It's in its infancy, this integration. And so that's why I wrote that paper that you were talking about before. I think that we have a long way to go to understand how the history, the evolution, both the underpinnings, the capacity to be moral that evolved, and then our cultural evolution of morality, including in the historical period, and then our development of it, relating that to our actual moral beliefs and getting the philosophers on board and understanding this stuff is just beginning. So I think in the next 5, 10, 15 years, that is really what has to happen. The philosophers have to get with the empirical program, and particularly have to start understanding evolution. And the evolutionary biologists have to stop being amateur moral philosophers and thinking that they don't have to do any real moral philosophy or listen to the people who have been studying this for 2,500 years.
Yeah. You're also interested in the evolution of religion, specifically biological factors that contribute to the development of religious beliefs. Many biologists, like Richard Dawkins, point to evolutionary biology as their evidence that religious belief is simply random or unnecessary. How would you respond to that?
I'll start by granting the evolutionary biologists like Richard Dawkins a couple of things. For one thing, I do think that religion has been, and perhaps still is, advantageous to humans in our groups. And I also recognize that the existence, the universality in all known cultures of religious belief, of course not all individuals in all cultures, but all cultures, does not provide evidence that there is something to be believed out there. But on the other hand, this argument that we have found a temporal process underlying religious belief, meaning a cultural and evolutionary history, and we've found adaptive explanations for it, somehow undermining religious belief is just nonsense. As evolutionary biologists, we assume that all of our traits have a history. They are underlain by a temporal process. Our arms and legs, our eyes, and so our morality and our religion, we should assume that that is going to be the case. So it's a little disingenuous to look for the temporal process as the undermining factor. We don't use the temporal process in explanations of any trait to undermine any other trait besides religion, although some people use it to undermine morality as well. So I would say a better way to go about it is to recognize humbly that there are certain people, such as myself, that think that the world would be a rather odd place if there was this universal search for the transcendent, and yet there's no such thing as the transcendent. And yet I have to recognize that there are a lot of other people, like Richard Dawkins, who think that a world is much stranger and so strange as to be rejected that there is such a thing as a transcendent that science cannot grapple with or cannot grasp. But I would say that that's the definition of the transcendent, that science can't grasp it, so we should not be surprised at that. So I think the humble approach is to allow for the transcendent and recognize that we are contingent beings whose tools, cognitive tools, are contingent products of an evolutionary process. So for us to just happen to have understood everything about the universe is like an ant being really sure that there's nothing outside of the ant farm. I just don't think that a really scientific-minded person would have that view.
And then what would you say to the person, the theist or the Christian, who would say, because you're putting a temporal lens on my belief in God, that somehow feels threatening or invalidates that belief?
I would say to that person that all of us accept, without any problem, the fact that our beliefs, religious beliefs, every belief, has a developmental history in ourselves. As zygotes, we did not have religious beliefs. As babies, we did not have religious beliefs. So there was a temporal process through which these things came about in our consciousness through a variety of means. So if that temporal process doesn't cause any problems, why should a temporal process that goes from generation to generation cause any problems? There's really no fundamental difference between development and evolution in terms of undermining or providing evidence against a religious view.
How do you, in Scripture, God says, God was the same yesterday, today, and forever. Was there at the beginning and always will be. It's this image of the constant or a constant. How does that play or interplay with this idea of in evolution of our religious belief and understanding?
Well, I think that God being eternal and never changing is an inherent feature of Christian theology, and yet our conception of God does not need to be eternal and unchanging in that same way. So if we go back far enough, there were humans, we can call them humans, biological humans, who had no concept of God. Before that, no concept of the afterlife. And before that, no concepts really at all, in the sense that humans have concepts today. We could redefine concepts such that other animals can have concepts, but in this advanced sense. And so it's not surprising if we come from organisms that did not have a concept of God, that even within our cultural and religious history, there have been changes in our understanding of God. And that is independent of the question of whether God exists and whether God is eternal and what that means.
You exist at what many people understand to be a very small subset of the population, a very tiny overlap in the Venn diagrams between people who believe in eternal, transcendent creator God as described in Scripture, and somebody who believes and understands and actually researches and seeks to understand further biological evolutionary processes for how the world came to be. How do you see those two actually overlapping with each other?
For me, the different disciplines, science, theology, the arts, the humanities, are human constructs, and they are ways of looking at the world. We have to carve up the way we look at the world because we can't, nobody can do everything. Nobody can research everything. You can't think in all ways at once. But the world, the actual phenomenon that we're studying, whether it is religion, morality, the world around us, the natural world, or humans, is itself a holistic thing. It's one thing. That's another feature of monotheism, that all truth is one. All truth is God's truth, you could say. And so for me, everything I learn about the evolution of morality and religion is something that is part of the created order. It is the handiwork of the grand architect. And so it's almost like when we research in two different fields whose methods are very different. Let's say we're thinking about things theologically and we can't prove anything, and it's more of an idea of what is the most beautiful and meaningful worldview I could have that is consistent with what I know about the world, but is not purely driven by evidentiary means, on the one hand. And then I have this other separate phenomenon, which is my science, where I have these rigid rules that govern what I will accept and what I won't accept. And it's on an evidentiary basis, and all my statements should be falsifiable, et cetera. Now, these are essentially like two people working on the same puzzle, where you have part of the puzzle being made over here, and you can sort of see what's going on, and then part of the puzzle is going on over here. But you know how it is when that's happening, when you know, you and your siblings are making a puzzle, and then at one point you say, hey, I see where this thing goes, you know? It's, you know, one person's working on space and the other one's working on the Millennium Falcon, and then you can see where it fits into the puzzle. And so that's the wonder of a holistic worldview. And so essentially my theological wonderings and musings, metaphysical opinions, you could say, my wandering around in the desert looking for the oasis of transcendence, is like working on the space. And it's much easier to be working on the things that are concrete and have evidence. But once you see where things are starting to fit together, that makes it worthwhile.
Yeah.